What's going on, y'all? KM Best here. Many people ask me what the best Series 4 and 5 cards are to buy. I'm going to rank every single Series 4 and 5 card in a tier list so you know how good each of them are. So, let's get started with this tier list. As you can see, we have separated everything into 7 tiers, starting with Elite cards that you should have absolutely no question about buying. Moving down onto All-Stars, cards that are generally better than everything else in their niche, but there is still some consideration for, okay, maybe I should be doing something else. And then, of course, solid build-arounds, which are build-arounds that have been typically previously pretty good, but right now are not finding the right metagame or seeing what they need to see. Annihilus is an example of this. Then there's solid role players. Basically, if Jeff and Nocturne are like glue guys in a bunch of decks in the All-Stars category, solid role players are going to be things that are worse than that, although I think Jeff and Nocturne probably do make it up to Elite. Mid is about where you want to stop buying these cards, probably. Like, I would not get things that are mid. That is just generally how I would approach this because of the value of Spotlight caches. Don't do this is definitely something you should not do. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And the final tier is Howard the Duck. I know people are going to get mad because they're going to be like, oh, it should be named Kang the Conqueror, or actually, I know what's going to happen. There's going to be like 50 people who leave a comment that should be like, oh, it should be named Hydra Bob. All right. Anyway, with that said, let's get going with the tier list itself. Alioth, I think, ends up in solid role players. Just a very, very good card and hard to replace for the specific effect, but not make or break to the decks that this card goes in the way some other cards are. Like, Alioth is excellent in Arishem decks, but a lot of that is because of the Darkhawk dance that has to happen here. Before Arishem came out, Alioth was a solid top end in Pixie decks, but like it's not like you can't play a Series 3 card instead of Alioth in those spots. The decks will still work, they'll just be a little bit worse in certain specific situations. Alioth is a great answer to narrow spots where like it's the only card that'll ever win you the game against certain things, but it's also like mostly replaceable outside of those specific scenarios. So I do think ends up in solid role players. Annihilus goes into solid build-arounds, and I think that's like fine. I'm generally okay with Annihilus going into solid build-arounds. He used to be like an Elite, an All-Star. It does bear noting that this card has fallen off like a pretty decent amount. Annihilus ends up being sort of not able to compete with the decks that are playing all the stuff that beats him. Like, not even like literally beating him, just like turning the Sentry into downside or into like not going over. If this card is not sending over the Sentry, it's usually not worth playing. And that, like, the fact that there's so many like Thena, Kitty, and the associated Jeff Nocturne that go in those decks make it just very hard for Annihilus to get the value you need out of him. In addition, the fact that Arishem is popular means that Annihilus tends to get thrown out of the decks that would run him in favor of Darkhawk. Just sort of ends up in an awkward, weird spot because Annihilus, Sentry, and Hood is a 3-card package, but so is Korg, Rockslide, and Darkhawk, and one of those is way more relevant to the metagame right now. Arishem is the easiest Elite, I think, of all time. I really can't think of an easier choice than putting Arishem into the Elite tier. That is as good as a card can get. I think this card has single-handedly redefined the Marvel Snap metagame. I think that it is probably the most valuable card you can possibly pick up right now. And it sort of serves this purpose as like the new high Evo, where it's like, this is a real card that does real things for even someone without a large collection level. I think Arishem is actually quite solid for that. Next up is Baron Zemo, who I am pretty sure ends up in the mid tier. I can't be positive about this. I think there's going to be people who are like, oh, it's a solid role player. I don't think any deck that has Baron Zemo in it is better for having Baron Zemo in it. They are like Darkhawk decks that win because they're Darkhawk decks, not because of Zemo. He's not bad. I don't want to say that he's like a bad card. He's like a 3/5 with upside, right? That's like a good thing to do. But I do think mid is the most appropriate descriptor of Baron Zemo right now. I think most people that run quote-unquote mill decks, especially in the Arishem meta, should not be doing that. Let's move on to Beta Ray Bill. I'm gonna go into solid role players here. I think Beta Ray Bill is maybe at the bottom of solid role players, but is a solid role player. This is a card that has a lot of very specific utility, and I think that's sort of what solid role players ends up being, where like this is only a card you're ever running if you're running Thor, if you're running Jane Foster. But you cannot play the Thor Jane Foster package profitably without Beta Ray Bill because he is such an important part of that. He ends up in the solid role players camp. Now we have Black Knight. Black Knight is going to go in the mid tier. He's been better before. I really do think Black Knight has seen better days. But right now, with Hela being what it is, and that's kind of the only place you want to run it, the power that Black Knight is generating, there used to be metagames where Black Knight could be his own plan. Like you'd have Black Knight and Ghost Rider and all of that. And that's just not really viable anymore. I think a lot of those decks were skating on like the cost reduction of old Zabu at the time. Like that was kind of a thing. So they'd be using like Ghost Rider final turn, play the sword final turn, stuff like that. So they're skating on either that or Sarah, and Mobius is very popular, and the power you're getting out of it isn't necessarily more than the power an Arishem deck is putting out. He just ends up in an awkward spot. Yeah. Black Swan is going squarely in the don't do this tier, and I just don't think you should ever be spending any resources on this card. It's just not a thing you should be doing. She's like barely playable. Like you can play the card Black Swan, and it's not the worst thing that's ever happened to you, but I don't think she's invest the amount of resources you need to get her playable, and I do think that puts her below even stuff like Baron Zemo and Black Knight, where it's like, I can imagine you playing something with those that is okay. Black Swan, I have seen people doing like Gwenpool, Black Swan bounce stuff. If that is your jam, I think it's all right. Like, I don't want to be too harsh on this stuff, but this is sort of where I'm at with it for sure. Blink, I think, ends up in solid build-arounds because of her power at converting things into what you want to see. There are multiple ways to use Blink. The most common is by just making sure that you get something ridiculous out of something small. So like Jubilee Blink is the traditional example. But there are other ways of using this card. For example, I play a Loki deck where the only thing that costs more than 3 other than Blink is Loki. You can use Blink to basically search out the Loki there. I honestly think that's a fairly underexplored aspect of Blink generally. And I do think she's just like the kind of card where it's like, this is a really solid, good card. You're probably not going to be upset to see in your collection, although it is a little bit specific. Blob is going to go into the All-Stars section here. Now, I do realize that that is contingent entirely on Arishem existing. However, Blob is effectively the best card in the Arishem deck, and it is basically like the highest priority pickup. Once you get the card Arishem, you need a Blob more than anything else in the entire game. You are multiplying its effect via cards like Mystique and Absorbing Man, and it's your best answer that isn't a straight-up tech card to the Darkhawk that everyone is running to try to beat you. Blob is the heavy lifter in the Arishem deck, and I do think that means he has to go that high right now, even though he is not played anywhere else. Many people might be surprised by Hydra Bob going straight to the mid tier instead of like the don't do this or the unplayable tier. I actually had like a 55% win rate, gained like 30 cubes with Hydra Bob the day of me recording this, using the deck that we actually talked about in my previous video. I think that Hydra Bob is legitimately a solid, interesting, powerful card. I don't think he's amazing. I don't think he's the greatest. I don't think you should buy him. But I've had more success with Hydra Bob than I have with Baron Zemo and Black Knight. I have legitimately, hand to God, had more success with the Hydra Bob deck than with Baron Zemo and Black Knight. Just straight up. That is an actual fact. And I don't really know how to square that circle. So in lieu of squaring that circle, I'm just going to simply put him in the mid tier. And we're just going to say that's where he is. I don't think you should get him. I do think he's like bad enough that they might buff him. But, like, again, like, he's in, like, that very, like, the mid-tier. And to be clear, when I say something's mid, I mean don't buy this, right? Like, I feel like that should be clear, but maybe it's not clear enough. Next up is Caeira, who has effectively one role, and that is stop your zoo stuff from being killmongered. That's kind of the only thing she does, and that is not a thing that needs to happen enough for her to be in solid role players. I think maybe 2 weeks ago you could have seen this card in solid role players. However, I don't think it's reasonable to put it up there right now. But I like, she'll jump between like this tier and the tier above it and maybe the tier below it, depending on how relevant what she does is. Right now is not that relevant. Previously, when Zoo was public enemy #1, it was very relevant. I think Cannonball goes into solid role players. You could almost talk me into solid build-arounds for this guy, but I do think that Cannonball right now is an interesting, unique card that is not the best card in clog decks anymore. Like, it's a fine card, but it went from this, like, overpowering Professor X combo card to this card's really not around that much, and it's fine that it's not around that much. I don't think anyone's going to be mad that Cannonball isn't here, but I do think that this is as high as you could possibly get him, and if you wanted to put him a tier below, I think that would be acceptable as well. Corvus Glaive goes in solid role players kind of by default. He is here because he is a role player in Hela. That's it. You don't really play him without that, right? You don't really play Hela without Corvus Glaive right now. And that is fine, I guess, right? Like, you don't play Hela without Corvus. I get it. That's fine. You do what you gotta do. But that is the literal only thing this card does, and the only reason you should be getting him is to do that thing. I would say Cull Obsidian is a solid role player as well. Now, this is a card that goes in Thanos. I don't really think a lot of people play Thanos, but you definitely play Cull Obsidian in it. He is a solid role player there. He goes in a bunch of these Scar Deathbird decks, a solid role player there. I've seen people playing him in the Dracula Dump Hydra Bob deck, solid role player there. Kind of the definition of a solid role player. Daken, I think, makes it to the mid tier, where there's almost certainly something better to be doing in any deck that wants to play Daken, but I really keep seeing like Silver Samurai decks, and it's like, I want to play it, but there's just no way. Like, Daken is just a little bit too weak and doesn't have enough balance knobs on him to make him that much better. Because it's like, okay, if you make him go to 3-5, suddenly that's a 3-10. Suddenly he's A, shangable, B, maybe too big. I don't know. I think he could be a 3-5 if you wanted. I think if he came out today, he would probably be a 3-5. So there is something to be said for maybe this card is supposed to have 5 power. I don't really think that he ends up in a good enough spot in any deck he's played in. I can't tell if Darkhawk should be in Elite or All-Stars. Because when I look at Darkhawk right now, I think it's impossible to describe him as anything but Elite. But it's so tied with Arishem. He has to be in Elite. I don't really think I have a choice about this. Like, Arishem warps the tier list just a little bit too much for him to be anything other than Elite. Part of the reason I do the tier lists in this format, as opposed to just like, here's a picture and you don't have to listen to anything I'm saying, is so that you can go to where I'm talking about a certain card and be like, oh, okay, that's what's happening here. That's what KM is doing, right? And I think that that is probably what will have to happen with this kind of tier list, because Darkhawk is the way every deck is trying to beat Arishem. You see him in everything from Thena decks to Cerebro 3. Yes, I have seen Cerebro 3 with Darkhawk Mystique in it, because that's what you have to do to beat Arishem. It is a little bit ridiculous. I genuinely do believe that. And yeah, Darkhawk is quite powerful and a very, very strong card. Elsa Bloodstone ends up in solid build-arounds. She's a little bit fringier than she used to be. You could argue her down a tier if you wanted, I think. But I am willing to say, like, okay, Elsa Bloodstone, I think she's still good. I think we're just not in a metagame that really favors what she does, because she's such an incremental bonus card, and Arishem is all about these big swings, and so every deck that's built for this metagame is all about these big swings rather than being an incremental bonus. Elsa's been as high as Elite, been as high as All-Star before, And so this is a bit of a downgrade for her. I would expect to see her, we're going to do at the end, we're going to sort of rework around all this stuff. I think we're going to move some cards up. We're going to move some cards down. But I do think that Elsa Bloodstone ends up probably at the bottom of solid build-arounds. And while we're here, I am going to move Hydra Bob down to don't do this. Yes, I've won more games with him, but I just, I can't honestly recommend it. We're going to move Hydra Bob down to don't do this. I think I have to. I don't feel good about him being that high. Let's move on to Galactus, who is going to go pretty firmly in the mid-tier. Maybe at the front of the mid-tier, maybe in like the middle of the mid-tier. Guy kind of sucks. I don't really know what to say about him other than it's hard to make him work, and right now you can put him in your Arishem decks and catch people by surprise, and that's cool, but it's probably not the best way to play Arishem, and I really can't think of a profitable way to be a Galactus gamer right now, nor should there be a profitable way to be a Galactus gamer. It's one of the least fun things in the entirety of the game. And yeah, I think that's a pretty fair rating for Galactus right now, because he is, at the very least, very cool, but yeah, not very good. Ghost Spider is, I think, one of the better role players in the game right now. Not only is she a key card in a Phoenix Force deck, she is a good card in the Dagger Clog lists and in the Move Bounce lists. Ghost Spider actually quite solid right now. I think a lot of people will look at this and be a little confused by it, but I think that like seeing reasonable play in at least 3 decks does kind of make you, by definition, a solid role player, I think. I think that is a very fair and reasonable thing to say. Now, next up is Gilgamesh, who I want to say goes at the bottom of solid build-arounds, probably above Elsa right now. Zoo has taken some hits, and in those hits, it has ended up being in a little bit of an awkward spot, Gilgamesh specifically, compared to the current metagame. I do think that it's possible that ends up changing, but right now, it's like, you want to be a 5-drop? Okay, well, you got to be Darkhawk right now. You got to be something ridiculous right now. You got to be beating Arishem stuff right now, and that's just hard to do with normal Zoo. That said, this guy is still very large. It's just like right now, a lot of the things that you would be getting out of him, you get out of Darkhawk 50% of the time. And this deck is not super well positioned into Clog stuff either. And Clog stuff is popular because of Arishem. So like that combination of awkwardness leads me to put Gilgamesh, solid build arounds, probably going to end up towards the bottom of it. Gladiator is a solid role player. I would say Gladiator probably goes above all of these, actually. It's like Gladiator and Alioth are probably the top of the solid role player tier. If I had to guess, that's where they end up going. They're good. Like, they're legitimately good, solid, reasonable cards. Gladiator just a 3/8 that's just like, you know, whenever you don't have something that's like way, way, way better, like a Nocturne or whatever, you can play Gladiator almost all the time. There are going to be some decks that leverage him better than that. Like, I've seen him being played in like quote-unquote mill decks, which I wouldn't really recommend doing. Right now, Gladiator's in a bit of an awkward spot, but he still is a 3/8, and that does give him some real power. I think you see him in Surfer decks, you see him in some Darkhawk decks, you see him around. He's definitely a card you're going to see, kind of exactly what we want out of the solid role players tier. Next up is Grandmaster, who's going straight into don't do this. I don't really have anything to say about Grandmaster other than don't do this. They got a 2-power buff. It's a little bit more playable than it was. There are really cool things you can do with this card, but none of them seem to be reliably better than anything you can do if you ran a different card instead of this card. And that's kind of what the don't do this tier is actually about. Gwenpool, I think, goes in solid role players. It's possible she ends up here. I think it's a little too early to tell with Gwenpool, so we're just going to have to accept that there's a decent chance, a reasonable chance that I just end up wrong about this card. Like, right now, I look at her and I'm like, that's a solid build around. I do think she's probably worse than everything else in this tier. I do play her in some decks, and she is quite okay there. The Mysterio overlap is definitely her best thing. I think she ends up here, but you could also very easily say she ends up like here or even here. And I think that Gwenpool is going to be one of those ones we might have to come back to at the end. Havok is going into Don't Do This because now that the Ravonna Prophex stuff is gone, this card is not something you're very interested in. It has been better in the past. Havok has been like up on the tier list, but right now, not really a thing you're super interested in. Definitely it's like okay, you can do it, and I don't necessarily think that you would be the worst person in the world for trying to play a Havok deck, but I don't think I can in any real world recommend one to you right now. Hercules is actually very hard to rate because we have Hercules as a pretty key linchpin of any move bounce deck. And then it's just a question of what that means. I would say Hercules is a lot like Corvus Glaive, where if you want to play the move bounce deck, you have to get Hercules. He's that good. And so he is to move bounce what Corvus Glaive is to Hela right now, I think is sort of where my head would be at. And in that vein, I think I'm going to move Cannonball below both of them. Ghost Spider has a little bit more general utility. I would say Hercules, like there's this little thing where it's like he's below a solid build around, but he is a required card for a deck. Where like there's this almost desire for another tier here, but I think that would get a little bit too confusing. Next up is High Evolutionary, and this depresses me, but he's going straight to mid. Like, I'm sorry, that card is just mid. There's really nothing else I can say about it. He's just mid right now. I want him to be good. I want him to be better so badly, but there is nothing I have seen that has ever convinced me that I should ever be playing this card, which is incredibly frustrating to me because High Evolutionary is such an important card for newer players who are getting into the later ranks of the game. It's so frustrating to look at High Evolutionary and be like, damn, I really wish I could have done something with that, but you can't, and that really sucks. Next up is Hit Monkey, who is going to end up basically in the same, like Hit Monkey is to bounce as Corvus Glaive is to Hela, as Hercules is to move bounce. Like that's what Hit Monkey is. So yeah, that's where Hit Monkey is going. That's pretty much where I'm at with as far as Hit Monkey goes. Next up is Hope Summers, who's going into solid role players. You see Hope Summers in various Kitty Pryde decks. You see Hope Summers in some Surfer decks. But there's a proliferation of options at the spot, and generally I would describe her as a role player in those decks. Sometimes she's doing something very specific, like enabling you to get to 8 energy so you can final turn Darkhawk Mystique without being afraid of getting tech carded by an Arishem, but mostly I think she's just like a pretty good card, a role player type card in those decks. Next up is Iron Lad, who I think like Iron Lad has been as high as here before and here before and here before, but now I kind of think Iron Lad ends up in this group. I think Iron Lad ends up in this group. People act like Iron Lad is this like incredibly amazingly playable card. It can go in anything, but I do not think that that is true. I think Iron Lad mostly sees play in Patriot deck and any kind of like Tribunal deck, and then after that you're like sometimes in Shuri Nimrod and other decks like that. And I think that does put him above. I think we're going to end up here with this stuff, right? Because these 4 right here, the Beta Ray Bill, Hercules, Corvus Glaive, Hit Monkey, they're like buy if you want to play the archetype. And then the rest of what's happening here, like these ones are like multi-archetype cards. These ones are buy if you want to play the archetype, and these ones are just like kind of there. That's sort of where my delineation on the solid role players tier right now. Jean Grey goes straight into don't do this. Don't do this. Don't play Jean Grey. Don't buy Jean Grey. Don't do anything with Jean Grey. Get her out of there. Don't spend resources on this card. That's as much as I'm going to say about this card. Next up is Jeff. Goes straight into Elite. Jeff is an absolute banger of a card. Probably the most played card of all time before Arishem came out. And I think it's for obvious reason. Whenever you want a good 2-drop, Jeff is that 2-drop. Easiest thing in the world to put him into this tier. Next up is Kang the Conqueror. Going into that Howard the Duck tier. Let's go, baby. Kang the Conqueror into the Howard the Duck tier. We know exactly why he's here. This is one of the worst cards in the entire game of Marvel Snap. He doesn't get you anything. I know people are going to be like, but KM, the information. It's not worth discarding a card. It just is not worth discarding a card. I'm sorry. Next up is Kitty Pryde, who I think probably ends up in All-Stars here, just because of the power that her package has with Thena, with Angela. I think Kitty Pryde ends up being what we would reasonably describe as an all-star enough of the time that this deck ends up being like it. I think she has to be there. When you think about what this metagame is other than Arishem decks, Kitty Pryde decks are like kind of the next thing you think of. And I don't really see any signs of that changing. The Thena stuff, the Angela stuff, it's all just really, really strong. Next up is Knull, who I think is in solid role players here. Probably like right around here, where if you want to play Destroy, you pick up Knull. It's actually very simple. Do you want to play Destroy? You go get Knull. Easiest decision of your entire life. Should you want to play Destroy? Much harder kind of question to answer, I think. Lady Deathstrike is going into mid, I think. This is a card I thought would be very good in Arishem. It turns out other 5-drops are just better to accelerate out. I think Lady Deathstrike goes at the top end of mid, where I can see myself playing this card, but it's not, it's usually like the 12th card in a deck. It's not really like all that incredible. Lady Deathstrike as mid makes a ton of sense to me, at least. And I think that's where she's gotta be. She's also a card you can play and destroy. That's like a thing that's gonna happen here. I do wonder about the ability to unnerf her. Like if she went back to 5/7, maybe we'd be talking about her a little bit differently. I'm not sure yet. Speaking of 5/7, Legion, I want to say goes at the top of mid, but I think has to go above Cannonball if we're going to be real about this. I think Legion has to go above Cannonball, but honestly, this is kind of convincing me that I want to move Cannonball down to the top of mid, I think. That's what I'm being convinced of right now. I want to move Cannonball down to the top of mid. Actually, you know what I want to do? I want to make a new tier real quick. That's what's going to happen. We're going to cut the video right here. We're going to make a new tier. That's what's going to happen. You're about to see the new tier just pop up magically on your screen. Okay, so what I've done here is added a buy if you want to play the deck tier. That's what seems like the best thing to do for Knull and Beta Ray and Hercules and Corvus Glaive and Hitmonkey. These are cards that really only go in one deck, but you can buy them if you want to play that deck specifically. One of the things I've been thinking about is moving Gwenpool down. I think I'm going to do that. I think she's going to end up going down to solid, probably around here, if I had to guess. That's where Gwenpool's going to end up at. And that is sort of where my head is at with this one. Next up is Loki, who's going into All-Stars, I think, pretty safely. A lot of people are going to tell you Loki is elite. I think that Loki's either the front end of All-Stars or the back end of elite right now. I think that it's a very good, it's a good deck, don't get me wrong. But I think people are more afraid of Loki than they should be. More, how I would sort of phrase it. People are worse at playing into this card than a lot of other stuff. And I do think that Loki ending up in All-Stars makes sense. Ending up in Elite also makes sense. We might revisit this one a little bit, but the point is, one of the best cards in the game. There are very few cards that are like straight up better. I think we're going to put him into Elite, but we might end up revisiting this in the future. Makari, like is one of those buy if you want to play the deck kind of cards. You basically buy her if you want to play like some weird surfer stuff. But I kind of think that you could also just put her in mid and say it's not worth buying her. And I think that's what I'm going to end up having to do. She ends up like roughly here, I think, most of the time. She's a playable and kind of decently good card, but I don't really know if I would sit on this and be like, yeah, it's not actually that good. Is there some consideration for dropping Jeff right now because of the, like, drop Jeff to All-Stars because of how willing people have been to cut him? I think that's okay. I think we can drop Jeff to the front of All-Stars. Let's move Man-Thing into the tier list. Man-Thing is going to go in mid, maybe even in Don't Do This. Is Man-Thing going into Don't Do This? Is Man-Thing at the front of Don't Do This? I think Man-Thing's at the front of Don't Do This, unfortunately. Yeah, I would not advise doing that. When you look at Man-Thing and you look at US Agents and you look at the numbers on those cards, yeah, no, one of them is just like way, 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 way better than the other, and that is just a really unfortunate thing. Let's get to Meek, who would almost be in buy if you want to play the deck. Like, you can, right? But I think he just ends up in mid. Like, I'm sorry, Meek, I love you. But I think he just ends up in mid a lot of the time. You can buy him if you want to play Destroy, but if I had to pick, or discard, if I had to pick one discard card that goes in buy if you want to play the deck, though, that would be Proxima Midnight. And so you end up with, like, I don't know, he goes like here, similar to Makari is sort of where I'm thinking about him right now. It's like, that's okay, but it's not what I love. You know what I mean? Mobius M. Mobius, I think, goes into All-Stars. I get it. This isn't like the greatest meta for Mobius, but even so, he's still just so around and so playable. Like, when you think about things like Loki, you think about things like Mockingbird, you think about things like Sasquatch, Mobius is such an important card for countering that. Even in a world where that stuff is seeing less play because of Arishem, it is still, like, I see Arishem decks running this, right? Like, that is a real thing. Mobius is that strong. He's a very powerful card. Next up is Mockingbird. Just straight into the top of Elite. Maybe, like the only things I can think I can really justify being higher than Mockingbird are the two most meta warping cards we ever have seen right now, which is the Arishem Darkhawk duo. Mockingbird is unreal. She is the core of so many things. She's great in the Arishem decks. She's great in every deck running Mysterio. Every Zoo deck runs her. She is the absolute queen, I should say, of this metagame. She does everything anyone could ever want a card to do. One of the best possible cards to pick up. So good, I think that I would be afraid of them nerfing her. I think, frankly, anything I put in the Elite tier is something you should be a little afraid of getting nerfed. Because, like, when stuff is that good, it is kind of one of those things. Now, the question would be, like, how much, right? But I think that applies to, like, Arishem, Darkhawk, Mockingbird, maybe a little bit less to Loki, but, like, yeah. She is an unshangable powerhouse for sure. Let's put MODOK into the buy if you want to play the deck tier. I'm not really going to, like, order these two specifically, but if you want to, like, play discard, the, like, Morbius type of discard, you want to play MODOK. And I think that that is sort of where I would be at with this. MODOK's a pretty solid card in that deck. That deck is a borderline playable deck, and if you want to be playing that deck, you should pick up MODOK while you can. Miss Marvel, I want to put in solid, but it's possible she ends up in mid. Like, I think she ends up, if Legion ends up in solid, Miss Marvel ends up probably a little bit ahead of him, but she's not really been in a great spot recently. I think you could argue her down to here, right? What's keeping her here for me is if you want to play Sarah, you have to have her. If you want to play the Beta Ray build decks, the best builds of those will also run her. And so it's like, those are not decks that I would necessarily recommend you play, but you are going to be able to use her in multiple spots. I do think that's enough for me to say she ends up in solid instead of mid. I have played decks with Miss Marvel in them recently, as opposed to more or less every card in the mid tier there. Namora is going to go into solid build around. I think Namora is actually just quite good. You could argue her above Elsa even, I think. Namora and the Wong stuff is just a strong thing to be doing. It's very linear, but it's very powerful. It is sort of very dependent on what the metagame looks like. When enough people are playing Cosmo, you cry yourself to sleep and you get very sad and you get Enchantress on your Wong or Cosmo on your Wong and you lose a million cubes and that all happens, right? But Namora is a pretty important part of Wong decks, and I think Wong decks are better now than they have been in basically any time in the past. And so that is an appealing card to me. I think it is super limited. It's kind of like a better version of buy if you want to play the deck is what solid build-arounds are here. And I do think that the Namora deck is better than the cards in buy if you want to play the deck. Nebula is... Jeez, is Nebula an all-star or is she at the top of solid? Because there's just no card that replaces Nebula. Does Nebula go here? I feel like Nebula ends up here, where it's just like, she's just so good at the thing that she does, and the thing that she does is just, like, it just happens just enough. I don't know. It's here or here. Let's say here. Let's say here. Because she's not seeing a ton of play right now because of Arishem. But there is, she is it has been just a good, solid card that I do like. And I'm not upset to own her. Speaking of cards that are, maybe falling off due to Arishem, but also maybe not, I want to put Nico Minoru in the back end of solid build-arounds, where maybe she's honestly maybe she goes up here where it's just you're never going to be upset that you got her. She just isn't as high a priority as other things. I don't know. She's so hard to rank right now because you can play her in a bunch of different things, but she could be anywhere from here to here, I think. Nico Minoru. I think we're going to put her here. But you could argue that she's supposed to be an all-star, and I would listen. She's in a lot of stuff, and she's very good. She could be at the top here or at the bottom here, and I don't know exactly how to phrase it. Key card in destroy decks, good in bounce decks, good in pixie decks, and as much as those exist anymore, just kind of does a bunch of good things that you want. Good in the bounce move decks. I think she ends up at the bottom of solid build-arounds, where she's so good in so many different things that she's not necessarily a build-around, but I think she just ends up there. I think you just have to put her there. Nimrod is buy if you want to play the deck. And that deck is Phoenix Force, and that thing does Shuri Nimrod. Hell yeah. If you are interested in playing Phoenix Force with Shuri Nimrod, you do need Nimrod to do that. And he does do something that no other card actually does. Let's put Nocturne into All-Stars. Maybe ahead of Jeff right now. Because Nocturne's body is so much bigger than Jeff's. I know it sounds weird, but 5 really matters a lot more than 3. Nocturne's a very clear all-star, and I think that is sort of readily apparent. But I think that right now, Nocturne ends up a little bit better than Jeff, just the way I think about it. I see a lot more Nocturnes than I do Jeff's in the metagame right now, and I do think that she ends up being a little bit better than him currently. Fastos is mid, and maybe don't do this, but we're gonna be nice and put him at the bottom of mid. You can play Fastos. Actually, I probably played Fastos more than the other cards at the bottom of mid. He's just the world's most replaceable card. The issue with Fastos isn't that he's bad. It's just that you're never gonna be damn, I really wish I had Fastos. That's just never gonna happen. And so he's just gonna be sitting in the mid tier right now. Pixie is hard to rank. I think she ends up in buy if you want to play the deck right now. She's been as high as like here. Like Pixie's been a metagame defining card right now, but it's just a little bit easier to cheat energy if you're gonna cheat with Arishem, right? Like there's not a lot of upside for Pixie, and that does frustrate me because I really want her to be good. She's a card I really enjoy. And the fact that I have to put her here is a little bit frustrating to me personally, but right now I don't think I have any. I would really want to rank her higher based on prior levels of performance, and I can't, and that sucks. Next up is Proxima Midnight, right below MODOK. You need these cards if you want to play Destroy. Buy it if you want to play the deck. Don't buy it if you don't want to play the deck. There you go. Ravonna Renslayer is definitely at least in solid build-arounds, definitely above these three, definitely above... I think she's going to end up at the top of solid build-arounds. I think Ravonna ends up at the top of solid build-arounds, and you might be like, Cam, what the hell are you talking about? She's so much better than that. But right now, the fact that she has to be a Darkhawk deck is taking away from her ability to do the things that made her so strong in previous metagames, such that you might not actually be like all that upset to replace her with a Hope Summers or whatever, because you're only really getting the discount on Iron Man and Mystique now, because sometimes you're like, I have to cut Sage to fit more tech into the deck. It's just a very awkward thing, and I think 2 weeks ago she'd have been much higher. Right now, I think it's like, it's fine. Ravonna is fine. She's a very good card. I would describe her as very good. If that deck wasn't forced into being a Darkhawk deck, she'd be much better. But it is forced into being a Darkhawk deck, so it's just very good, right? Red Guardian fell off so hard. Red Guardian has fallen off to such an incredible amount. This was one of the best cards in the game, and now is okay. Red Guardian has been hurt more than anything else by the Arishem meta, and I think that is just a crazy sentence to say, but it is absolutely true, because if things are not Arisheming, right? Like, first of all, Red Guardian not being played in Arishem, not very good against Arishem, right? Second of all, the second most common decks after Arishem decks are Mysterio decks, and Mysterio means that you're never actually going to hit the stuff you want to hit with a Red Guardian. And so it's just so awkward for this guy. He also lost when Red Guardian was at his best, he was like free rolling these Angelas, and that isn't happening anymore, and that deck isn't as common anymore. And so the Red Guardian, huge fall off here for sure. Enormous fall off. Red Hulk is gonna go into the solid tier. I think he's roughly in the range of these cards, where he's extremely good in like clog decks right now. He's just good at that. He still does his job well, but he used to be like up here-ish. Now I think he ends up here, would be my guess. Top of solid is sort of where my thought process is at. Been nerfed a couple times, but still really just, clocking in, doing his little workman-like, brings his lunch pail to work, real coach's son. He's doing what he does, right? He's just a good card that is very, very solid here. A reasonably powerful card. Next up on the tier list is Sage. Probably top of solid, if I had to guess. That's probably where this card ends up. Again, it's a consequence of Arishem. 2 weeks ago, much higher. Now, because of the way that the Ravonna decks are forced to invest in Darkhawk decks, Sage ends up a little bit worse. You could put her here if you wanted. I think this would be fine. I think if you wanted to do this would be fine. I think that's okay. But I'll tell you, actually, like, I kind of want to drop Annihilus to the bottom of this and then Blink to, like, here. And then Elsa to, like, here. I kind of think this makes the most sense. And you could even, like, you could even talk me into, like, Gilgamesh ending up over here. I think Gilgamesh ends up here. It's like this. This is like our big question mark right here. I think right now we're going to leave it as is, but we'll see about it. Next up is Sasquatch. Solid build around for sure. Gonna be just below Sage. I think that Sasquatch is a strong card that does a lot of work, and people, for some reason, really underrate this card, but I had a ton of success with Sasquatch in Mysterio decks. Mysterio decks are kind of being played a lot because of Gwenpool. Am I too high on Sasquatch? I think it's possible that if anything on this list is wrong, that is the thing I'm the most wrong about. But I do think Sasquatch is like a good card. Although I do think there is something to be said for maybe putting her in this tier here, because she does sort of fit that mold of you're only ever playing her in the Mysterio deck. She's only ever going to be in that. So maybe because she's so limited in scope, she ends up in buy if you want to play the deck instead. I think that's a potentially valid way to approach her here. But at the same time, you could also say, you know, there's multiple versions of them. Maybe she goes here. I think we're going to put her in solid. I think that's where I'm at with her. I think that's where I'm at with her. Yeah, I have arrived at that. Next up is Sebastian Shaw, a very buy if you want to play the deck for Silver Surfer. That's Sebastian Shaw. Buy if you want to play the deck, but for Silver Surfer, we are there. That is what Sebastian Shaw is. He is a Silver Surfer card. He is absolutely never going to be anything other than a Silver Surfer card. So go play him in your Silver Surfer deck. That is what you're going to do. Selene in Howard the Duck tier. That's kind of all we really need to say. That's a Howard the Duck type card, and it is going in Howard the Duck tier. Cersei ends up in... She's better than Annihilus. So she ends up in solid build-arounds, but not that great, I think, is where I would put her, is sort of where my head is at. I think the way I think about this, I have to go, this goes here, and then Elsa goes here. I think it ends up looking like this a little bit to me, in terms of, like, things I'm afraid of seeing. Actually, we're going to put Annihilus at the back. I really don't think that card is very good right now. It's the very, very most solid of that tier, where it's like, I don't know about this. I am not interested in playing that card. Now, some people might put Silk in buy if you want to play the deck. I honestly think that Silk ends up in the mid tier. Like, I get it, but no. I just no. I don't think that's a serious consideration. I am not a fan of any deck that plays Silk. I know there's been a Professor X deck that Butt made going around that's like a move deck, but I talked to him about it and he was like, yeah, I don't think it's all that good. It's just really good and overperforming on the Muir Island hot location, and that's sort of where that deck came from. It's like baseline playable, but I really wouldn't recommend it. I think that's just not something I'd be interested in doing. The same goes for Scar, who is... See, like, it's hard, right? Because I put Cull Obsidian up here, but Scar is like maybe a buy if you want to play the deck thing for the Deathbird deck. And I do think that is maybe something you could be talking about. But right now, he's very much like buy if you want to play Deathbird. If you don't want to play Deathbird, he kind of only goes in that. I think that's really the only thing that's happening here. Snowguard is very hard to rate. Like, just a very hard card to rate. So I'm gonna just like sketch myself out of this and just be like, Snowguard, solid, just like near the top of solid, because goated Loki card, but mostly only playable there. But also when you pick up Snowguard and you're like, I need a 1-drop for stuff, she's like a really, really good budget replacement for a ton of stuff. Like, that's one of the unique things about Snowguard is she's an amazing budget replacement for like a genuinely shocking amount of stuff. And so there is something to be said for her in that aspect of card collection as well. Next up is Spider-Ham, who's gonna be mid, I think, but like more towards the top of mid. It's like a playably mid card, I think. It's not like the hardest of cards to be like actually mid. I don't ever think I'd want to play it, but I know people do, and that's a totally fine thing to do, I think. I'm not going to get like too mad at someone for playing Spider-Ham, so that seems kind of mid to me. Supergiant goes in buy if you want to play the deck. Probably towards the top end of it. Maybe right here, I think, is where I'd ballpark the buy if you want to play the deck cards, right? Maybe we drop Pixie just a little bit. Maybe drop Pixie to there. And then, like, in order, we have buy if you want to play the deck for Silver Surfer, Sebastian Shaw, Knull as Destroy, Pixie as Pixie, Beta Ray Bill for the Thor deck, Hercules for Move Bounce, Corvus Glaive for Hela, Nimrod for the Phoenix Force deck with Shuri Nimrod, Supergiant for various Supergiant Negasonic type decks, Hitmonkey for bounce decks, MODOK and Proxima for discard, and Scar for Deathbird. And, of course, Thanos for Thanos. Yeah, Thanos probably ends up, like, marginally more playable than some of this stuff. I'm going to put him in about the middle of buy if you want to play the deck. He's, okay. He's an okay card who does okay card things, but none of these decks are exciting enough to me that I would want to do them over the stuff in the very top of the tier list here, which is why that tier exists. Living Tribunal is exactly the same as that. It's like it only exists if you want to play this deck. It is the only thing that this deck does. You can be a Tribunal gamer if you want. I would not recommend you do it, but you totally can. Phoenix Force ends up in solid build arounds. I do think that Phoenix Force is actually just a pretty good card, a pretty good deck right now. And since there's a Loki build and a Nimrod build, you are not locked in to any of them. Phoenix Force it would be like the top of buy if you want to play the deck, but it is such a deck of itself, right? Where it's like, you can't play Phoenix Force without Phoenix Force. You can try to play Silver Surfer without Sebastian Shaw. You can try to do that, right? And Phoenix Force is it is a presence in the metagame that is a real threat. It is a powerful, powerful card. We're going to put Thena into All-Stars, right next to Kitty Pryde. She is the premier early game scaler right now. Just about as good as any card has been at that role. Angela, of course, is her best friend, and that allows her to succeed to a high level. Strong card. Thena, Kitty, Elsa type stuff. It's a pretty well-worn package at this point. It doesn't have as much flexibility as it otherwise would because of the issues with having to run Darkhawk. Next up is US Agent, who's going to end up in solid, I think. This card has really fallen off for me. Where I just think that I'm not sure where I would want this card to be. It's not very good anymore, and it's not US Agent's fault, but it's like, again, it's about the metagame. Things are too big for that card to matter marginally, right? If your opponent is dropping a blob on you, this guy's not doing much. It's tough. It's a very tough spot for this card to be in. In small ball metagames, he's phenomenal. We're not in one of those right now, which is very frustrating to me. Valentina is going into the top of mid, which is to say, I think she's actually quite good, but she's maybe the most replaceable card in the world. There's not a single deck where you're playing Valentina and you're like, I can't replace Valentina. I'm so mad I didn't buy Valentina. That's not real. Every deck that plays Valentina, you can replace her. If you're playing her in Loki, replace her with any of the other 2-drops. If you're playing her in Arishem, replace her with pick any card, right? Like, she's good, but she's so insanely replaceable that I don't really think there's a case for putting her in any tier other than mid. Next up is War Machine. I think War Machine is going to go straight into the don't do this tier. The don't do this tier, I think, is where War Machine has to go. And War Machine, not good. I wouldn't advise you play War Machine. It's pretty bad. It's just not really what anyone. You're not really interested in 4/6s in this metagame. I don't know if you've noticed, but 4/6s, not the move right now. It's everyone, like, there people are playing multiple blobs and you're like, I'm gonna cheat out the Infinite. No thanks. Werewolf by Night is gonna be mid. Just a mid card right now. Like, maybe towards the top end of mid, probably like here-ish if I had to guess where Werewolf by Night ends up going. Not a great card. Not a strong card. Not a card that anyone needs to be afraid of. I think a lot of people, when it got on nerf, myself included, were very afraid of what it could be. Forgot that Beast getting nerfed was kind of an issue. Like, a lot of werewolf stuff was really predicated on, like, you would play the werewolf, you'd play some 1-drops and Beast them, then you'd play some 1-drops and Falcon them, and that's how he got to those numbers. And Beast's discount not persisting was like a really big hurt to how you want to play that card out. And so you end up just like this card that is just not good enough, unfortunately. Next up is going to be White Widow, who is going to be an all-star. I think White Widow is a pretty clear all-star, actually. She just is good. Like, she just is good and goes in a bunch of decks. And I know people are going to be like, what do you mean she goes in a bunch of decks? You can probably cut any 2-drop from any deck you play and put White Widow in and be like, that's fine. It's legitimately that kind of replaceable, right? Like, A, Clog decks are around and they're good. B, if you're going to play Cersei, you're probably playing this card too, because you might have a Clog sub-theme in there because of Debris and Mockingbird and things like that. C, she'll randomly win you locations like Bar Sinister. I have not had a Bar Sinister game that does not involve this card in like 2 weeks. Like, she's just everywhere. She's a very good card. A very, very, very good card. X23 goes right next to Knull in buy if you want to play the deck. I have no opinion on which one is stronger. If I had to guess, I would say X23 is the stronger of these cards. She's critical for every Deadpool deck, and she goes very well with Knull, because what she enables you to do is have a final turn that is Deadpool and Knull. That turn 5 extra energy is very important. Finally, we have Zabu. And Zabu is gonna go... Do I have to put Zabu in Howard tier? The Howard the Duck Memorial tier? Do I have to put Zabu in the Howard the Duck Memorial tier? Oh my god. I do. I have to put Zabu in the Howard the Duck Memorial tier. Oh my god. That's so painful. That's so painful. I think I have to put War Machine in here too, if we're gonna do that. But that is so painful. Wow. 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 The Howard the Duck Memorial tier has gained another member. That's insane. Zabu as an on reveal just is not a card. I don't really know what to say about that. I've seen some speculation that he's going to get an activate trigger based on like an answer Glenn Jones gave in the Discord that was like, we have a plan for Zabu, we just can't tell you it yet. And yeah, that is, I can't think of anyone who needs that more. Alexa, play Despacito. That's just ridiculous. Okay, so here's what the tier list looks like right now. What I'm going to do, because I'm recording this live, there is a fairly active chat that is going right now. You can't see them, but I'm going to leave them. I'm going to have them ask questions. So hopefully whatever Q&A type things that you would have about this tier list, feel free. We're going to hopefully get some of those answers in here. So chat, if you have any questions, let me know, and I will read them out and try to answer them about various placements on this tier list. Why are Jean Grey and Man-Thing so low? Because they're very, very mediocre cards that you should not buy. Is X23 missing? Nope, she is right here. She is absolutely right here. Very solid buy if you want to play the deck tier. But yeah, the Jean Grey and Man-Thing, I'm very confident are in like the right spot here. With Nico's flexibility in so many decks, does she not rank higher than Gilgamesh and Demora? I think that's valid. I think that I would accept that. I would accept Nico going up to here. I think that's fine. I think that's a good point. You're right. Shouldn't Cannonball be in this deck tier since he's important in Clog? He is not run, in my opinion, in the best builds of Clog right now. I do not think so. If Arishem didn't exist, where would Darkhawk go? Oh, like 3 or 4 tiers down. Like, if Arishem didn't exist, and we talked about this during the Darkhawk thing, 3 or 4 tiers down. Is Mockingbird elite because of Arishem? No, Mockingbird is elite because of Mysterio. Mockingbird is elite, yeah, also Arishem, but it's like Mysterio is the main culprit there. Why isn't Thanos in the Howard tier? Can you tell me with a straight face that Thanos is worse than Hela right now? Can you tell me with a straight face that Thanos is worse than Discard right now? I think they're roughly in the same level of like playability. Why isn't Alioth higher? It gets run in the best Arishem decks. Because you can probably play those Arishem decks with a different 6-drop. You probably cannot play them without a Blob, right? And so part of what the point of this tier list is to talk about what you should prioritize in a general sense, but I can't tell you, like, otherwise it would just be every card that gets played in Blob would be at the top, right? I think it's way easier to replace an Alioth in an Arishem deck than it is to replace most of the cards in the tiers above it in the decks that they go in. That's sort of where it's at. Why High Evo not the same tier as Thanos? Because honestly, he is worse. Like, as awful as that is, he is worse. Why is Hope only in Solid? I think she's at the top of Solid for whatever that's worth, but it's because she gets like fairly sparse play in fairly specific scenarios, some Silver Surfer decks, some Kitty decks. She has like some extra utility in the Arishem metagame, or she did before every Arishem deck started really teching against this, by allowing you to do final turn Darkhawk Mystiques. But yeah, it's a little awkward, I think, for that card right now. But I think that it's like, you know, down to like here in Solid, you're talking about genuinely good cards, I think. Down to like right about Gwenpool, we're talking about like, these are good cards. This is what the meta is. If you were just looking at like Elite and then like the first, you know, 9 or so cards of Solid, yeah, like from Elite to the first 10 or so cards of Solid, those are the things I see all the time. Why is MMM so high again? The card Mockingbird. It's pretty much it. It's the card Mockingbird, the card Loki. Which of the Howard tier do you think will be buffed first? Zabu? I think it's way too hard to figure out how to buff Kang or Selene. So Zabu seems like a card that's like an easier buff target than the other ones in there, I think. That's sort of where I would be at. All right. That will conclude the Q&A section. I'm going to have to go edit the crap out of this. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed what we did here. It was kind of a blast for me. I had a ton of fun. It's gonna be the longest editing job I've ever done in my life. It's gonna be ridiculous. Thank you so much for making it through that video. Holy crap, that was really long. I really appreciate it. I've been Cam Best. You have been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one.